Greetings, my name is Louise Dente and I welcome you to yet another edition of Cultural Caravan. On this edition is a special as we are going to discuss the topic of critical race theory, a topic that has become very controversial over the last few years. We are here at a local college and we're really ready to begin our conversation with our three distinguished guests. Are you ready? Well, I am. Let's go. One of the things that, has come up is a topic entitled Critical Race Theory, or CRT, and unraveling the controversy in pursuit of telling the American story. So the main thing is that we really want to share some ideas with you in hopes that you get another understanding of what it is and certainly what it's not, and hopefully take it from there. One of our goals, we only have a few minutes with you, is to really define what critical race theory is, to talk about the historical implications and rationale of CRT, what is the backlash against CRT, and recommendations on infusing African American history in curricula. So those are some of the things that we're going to touch upon today. So let's get right to it. So I'm going to ask my colleague, Basir Mchawi, to really talk about introduce what is critical race theory.
Good afternoon, everybody. Critical race theory is an interdisciplinary legal substance. It was developed back in the 1970s by scholars like Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, and Richard Delgado, and others. And it looked at the laws of the United States in a way which asked, why does racism exist within the legal structures of this particular society? Now, the interesting thing about it is that, unlike some people would tell us, it has not been taught in K-12 schools. It was something that was discussed within law schools, and legal scholars and law students would go ahead and look at the legal structure of the United States and try to find out why there was this persistence of racism within the structures. Now, the interesting thing is that it's been in existence for quite a while. We can talk about, well, since it's been in existence for so long, why have not people actually responded in the negative fashion which we've seen over the last 3 years? To give an example, Derek Bell was one of the people who actually founded this particular discipline. He wrote a book back in 1992 called Faces at the Bottom of the Well. It talked about the permanence of racism. It was a New York Times bestseller, and there was no great controversy about it. People thought about the content of the book. They looked at this framework for critical race theory, but there was really no controversy. And the fact that it was a New York Times bestseller says something in and of itself, that this was something that people were literally interested in. Now, in 2023, and for the last 3 years, we've been engaged in this conversation about what critical race theory is, and numerous people have determined that for some reason, now all of a sudden, that there's some kind of problem. So we are here this afternoon to talk about critical race theory and to address some of the issues and some of the controversy around it.
Soraya, could you please clarify some examples of this in terms of systematically?
Yes, hello. Some of the examples of systemic racism are redlining. That was the practice decades ago, before the civil rights movement, where the government basically drew red lines around areas that were predominantly black and forbid banks from lending. And this was lending in buying homes for business purposes. So black people were economically challenged, those who wanted to open businesses, those who wanted to buy homes, because the banks were not allowed to lend. And of course, the people did not know that this was the case. You also had instances of, well, well-known instances of Jim Crow. That's another example of systemic racism. This was actual American laws in predominantly the South, but there were certainly areas of the North where this was also predominant, where black people couldn't live certain places. You had to be worried for your life if you offended certain folks, because your life could be in danger. You weren't allowed to go to certain stores or theaters. Your whole life was pretty much dominated by these unjust legal structures, because that was the law of the land until the Civil Rights era, where these laws were changed. So this dominated people's life in their economic potential. If you can't buy a home or have a business, or you're strictured where you can't, your freedom of movement is even challenged, how far can you go in the society? So these systems were very oppressive and prolonged until we had challenges through the civil rights movement to remove them.
The concept of intersectionality in CRT basically is the way in which different forms of inequality and identity are affected by intersections of race, class, gender, and disability. Basir, can you explain that in terms of intersectionality?
Well, intersectionality has to do with the idea that there are commonalities between the issues of race, of gender, of class. So as opposed to people whose, I guess you could say that their main struggle is engaged in the specifics of, for instance, gender or class or race, that there is the possibility that all of these people could literally work together, that there are connections in regards to the struggles that are related to race, class, and gender.
Well, we have an example of the marijuana laws. Recently, we've seen them being relaxed, but in the past, we know that blacks and whites smoke marijuana at basically the same rates. But overwhelmingly, the criminal justice system has been used in a punitive form toward black people. They are the ones who are the most caught up in the criminal justice system for selling, buying, and even consuming marijuana. And black people only make up, 14% of the population, and yet for marijuana crimes, they made up pretty much the majority of the inmates. So we see that the liberal notions of the law being able to equally disperse among people, that's false, because the criminal justice system very heavily impacted black people to the point where now you have the laws being very much relaxed in a lot of states where it is now legal to consume marijuana. Well, this happened because the laws were so out of joint where it came to black people, and they were being punished so harshly for these crimes that the people started to complain and the legislators started to see, look, this is an injustice that we have to try and fix. Now, if you look across the country, obviously every state has not entertained these laws, but enough have, where it's relaxed enough, and now people are even being allowed, who were formerly incarcerated for selling, to be the first ones to get licenses to sell this. So little by little, the laws are changing, and that's a good thing, but there was not there was not an equal application of the law where it came to punishment for the infractions of the past, which is why now in the future, there is an attempt to change this.
In terms of healthcare?
In terms of healthcare also, we see that there are disparities in the medical treatment. There's a problem very recently with Black women given childbirth. They were, say, 3 to 4 times as likely to die in childbirth than white women. And we find that there's really problems in our medical, there's racism in the medical field, to the point where it's said that Black women do better under Black doctors when they're pregnant. Now, we look at stuff like this and it looks terrible, but it is still a problem in the American society. Things are supposed to be equal among people, but the disparities are glaring. And we know that there has to be, like in this day and age, there are too few Black doctors. There needs to be more. There needs to be more medical people, doctors in particular, of color. But again, that goes to disparities of the past and past discrimination, why there is not more Black doctors as opposed to doctors of other ethnicities. These are challenges of the society that need to be corrected.
Thank you. Now we wanted to look at the historical implications of and rationale for CRT. Dr. William Seraile?
If we look at so-called science and theories, back in 1851, the Dr. Samuel Cartwright had advice for slave owners, and so he said, in order to control your enslaved people, you have to look out for 2 diseases. One was called drapetomania, it's a word he made up, and he said basically drapetomania was a disease causing Negroes to run away. In other words, they're running away because they're mentally defective, not because they're trying to get freedom. The other disease was called Disathesias aethiopica, disease causing Negroes to be destructive. So again, he was talking about their behavior. Now, that might sound like something in isolation, but then you look at implications of those so-called diseases. We know today a lot of young children get suspended from school, or young Black children, much more than young white children, because the mindset of, say, school administrators is, oh, these kids are rascals. You know, they misbehave too much. Later on, there are obviously a lot of stereotypes like you're talking about, but in 1902, a clergyman by the name of Charles Carroll wrote a book. The book was titled Mystery Solved, the Negro is a Beast. So he's looking at the historical perspective, the Garden of Eden, with Adam and Eve. According to this clergyman, there was someone who looked like an African in the Garden of Eden who didn't have a soul. But he looked like an African. And instead of Eve being tempted by a snake, she's tempted by an African-looking man who was a beast. And therefore, white women were in danger of being raped by Black men. So his answer was either colonization, which means get rid of them, send them to Africa or someplace else, or extermination. That's rather harsh. But you look at statistics involving lynchings, you find there were over 400 lynchings between 1900 and 1905. In 1906, there was massacres in Atlanta, Georgia. In 1915, we had this movie called Birth of a Nation, which they still use today for film studies, shown in the White House under President Wilson. but that caused a lot of racial activities, again, killings of people. In 1919, we had what's called the Red Summer. Now here, black men coming from France who fought in World War I were being attacked in uniform because they're challenging the system, because they came to France and they saw some degrees of freedom. So in 1921, you have Tulsa, Oklahoma, destruction of the community. So the issue here is that these stereotypes have implications for that time period and certainly for today. It was obviously, slavery was enslavement of people was big business. It lasted for several hundred years, where people were stolen, bought, captured, however, and brought to the Americas, the Caribbean, and the United States. Certainly the largest number went to Brazil, and the second largest number went to the Caribbean, and the least came here to the United States. But it made people very, very wealthy. People who built ships, people who had insurance, issued insurance policies on the lives of slaves, the people who, the brokers who dealt with cotton and rice and tobacco, shipbuilders. You may have read some time ago about Georgetown University, a major university in the United States, that survived because it sold a good number of enslaved people that they owned, that property. This is a photograph of men in Congress during what they call Reconstruction, right after the Civil War. The Republican Party had power over the defeated Confederacy, and for the first time, black men in those states like Alabama and Mississippi had the right to vote, and a number of them went to Congress, including 2 who went to the United States Senate. Reconstruction ended in 1877, and that's when a lot of the racial atrocities began in earnest. It's just a stereotype of what we call Jim Crow. Jim Crow was actually a dance that was pioneer, and a lot of white entertainers began to copy it, and it's just showing people who they considered to be like buffoons, people who didn't really have any personal dignity. In 1923, the United States Senate proposed a bill to make a statue to Mammy. It didn't go further than just a discussion in the Senate in 1923, same year that 28 black men were lynched. But Mammy was the caretaker, the one who took care of the children, took care of the elderly, the sick, at the expense of not taking care of her own children, because she'd taken care of the little white kids. And a lot of Southerners said they had fond memories of Mammy, because that's the one they really loved. They didn't love their mothers weren't around, the mothers too busy, they haven't gone to parties and so forth. So there's a black woman who took care of these little kids. And so that's who they turned to when they felt injured. You had all these stereotypes in time period in the latter part of the 19th century when black men and women were doing inventions that made the United States a major industrial power. We're sitting in a room right now with a lot of electricity, and everybody might say, oh yeah, Thomas Edison, but it was Lewis Latimer who came up with what became known as the carbon filament. If you have a light bulb and it goes out, you kind of shake the light bulb, you hear a little rattling, that's the carbon filament. It's a black man, Lewis Latimer, who came up with that invention that allowed electricity to last for a long time period, which is a big change in terms of having lights at nighttime. You have that in factories, you have that in stores, you have it in homes. But the image that people had in mind was the coon. And that's why you had a lot of Hollywood movies in the 20s and 30s. You had the black man, the coon. There was a very famous actor named was Lincoln Perry. He had a house in Harlem at one time. Lincoln Perry, according to Hollywood, was called, anybody know his name?
Step and fetch it.
Yeah, Step and Fetch It.
Yes.
Hollywood called him Step and Fetch It. And he was a coon. He was one who, they asked him a question, he said, I don't know, boss, what you talking about, boss? Police would say, did you just run right past here? Run, boss, I barely can walk. But that was a coon. A lot of you may have saw the movie King Kong. You might saw the original one when it's on television, or maybe more recent ones. King Kong represents an African man, and that represents what Charles Carroll was talking about. The Negro is a beast. Because you have a white woman who falls in love with him, in the movie version, but he's destroyed by the airplanes. And that represents the Negro beast. Now, that might sound like kind of crazy, way out. How can you have this ape-like person or animal represent an African person? But then you look at that, and then you think of all the incidents. Think about the football players who go to white universities and become stars, and the coach tells them one thing: "You're here, boy, to play football. You got a girlfriend back home. Stay with her. Don't bother with these white girls on campus." Because it's a fear. When black men got lynched, they were castrated, and their sexual organs were cut off and put in a jar to preserve them, because someone's trying to say, "See, I'm better than you finally."
Yeah, I think one of the questions, you noticed there's a picture on Vogue, and you have LeBron James, and he has a model with him, Giselle, and just looking at his mouth, and I'm just asking people to compare what LeBron looks like versus the ape. Is there similarities there? Wouldn't you say, in terms of, look at their mouth? You see his mouth is open like the ape, and he looks like he's deranged, right? So it's just odd that that they would, that someone, a publisher, would take something based on a stereotype and actually put together a picture. So, as you know, as we think about what the purpose, what CRT is, the question today is, what is the backlash against CRT? And I'm going to ask our presenters, starting with Basir Mchawi, to tell us what is some of the backlash.
Well, in about 2000, there was a tweet that went viral. It was a person who, his name is Christopher Rufo, who no one knew anything about, and he tweeted about CRT, critical race theory. This was picked up, it went viral, and all of a sudden, it was this great backlash. People started talking about critical race theory is taught in schools K through 12, which, as we said, is not true. People started talking about, well, critical race theory includes, for instance, the idea that in some government agencies we would be teaching things like diversity. Now, when you think about it historically, one of the first government agencies to actually, quote, integrate was the U.S. Armed Forces. And when they did this back in the late 1940s, it was quite obviously necessary to go ahead and develop some kind of diversity training. Because previously, as many of you would know, up through World War II, that the United States Armed Forces were segregated. There were black units and there were white units. So I guess we have to say that it was very courageous for the armed forces to be one of the first government agencies to force integration. And this happened after World War II, when African American soldiers had shown how competent they were in battle. You have the example of the Tuskegee Airmen. I don't know if any of you heard about these airmen who were fantastic pilots, who went ahead and did their duty better than anyone else. So when this was seen, all of a sudden it was felt, well, we need to integrate the armed forces. And in order to do this, it was going to be necessary for people to undergo some kind of training and study. So of course, at that particular point, things like diversity training became necessary. So for some reason, we've had, and we have to say that I guess it has to be political, that we now have people talking about, well, we shouldn't have any diversity training, that we shouldn't teach African American history in schools. Because why? Well, young people will feel uncomfortable. But the question, of course, is, are we going to tell the truth about American history? Or are we going to make up some kind of fairy tale in regards to talking about things that literally did not happen? Or to erase things from the history books themselves? There are examples in regards to history that we can talk about, even in the area where we are right now. Let me give you a quick example. Reedy Town, and Dr. Seraile can talk about Goldstown. In the area, Tinton, New Jersey, Amsterdam, Asbury Park, New Jersey, there was an area that had been settled as early as 1780 by freed Africans and native peoples, the indigenous peoples. And many of their last names were Reevy, and it ended up being called Reedy Town. Now, this town existed up until the 1970s and 1980s, when 900 acres of this particular land were taken by eminent domain, and a garbage dump was created. That garbage dump was called the Monmouth County Reclamation Center. That's what it was called. And this is a few miles from here, Asbury Park, which you know, Tinton, New Jersey, which you know. But if you look in the local history books, you don't see anything about Reedy Town. So of course, there's a need to have information like this in our history books, whether we talk about locally, nationally, or for that matter, internationally. So the question at this particular point really is, why are people getting so upset in regards to this issue of critical race theory?
Well, I hope you've enjoyed this broadcast, and we continue to encourage you to tune in, to write, and to tell a friend. But please visit our website at www.ccptv.org. But until next time, Louise Dente saying thank you.